You know, there are mysteries that have existed for thousands of years, and even today they still leave all of humanity puzzled. And in the golden desert of Egypt, massive stones stacked on top of each other with an accuracy that is hard to believe still stand tall, defying all explanations. The pyramids, a structure that makes many people think of aliens before they think of humans. But that is unfair to the extraordinary intelligence of the ancient Egyptians. Therefore, in today's journey, we will dissect facts, verified perspectives, and even strange hypotheses, all in the spirit of education, commentary, analysis, adhering to fair use. If you enjoy exploring mysterious stories like this, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and remember to watch until the end of the video because the ending will change the way you see one of the greatest wonders ever created by humans. And now, where are you watching from? What time is it there? Leave a comment. I really want to know who this journey is connecting across the world. If you want to find a place where engineering, human strength, and perseverance intersect in the roughest way imaginable, then the quarry is the perfect starting point. Because before any stone became part of a pyramid, it was just an anonymous piece of Egyptian bedrock, lying silently for millions of years, waiting for a group of strong, sweaty, and slightly beer-weary workers to knock on its door. There is nothing glamorous here. No glittering gold of the pharaoh's tombs, no religious symbols, and no mystical astronomical marks. This is a place where the craft of stone carving means exactly what it says, carving stone and carving endlessly. Ancient Egyptian workers began their workday with tools that today you might see in museums or in a child's toy tool set. Bronze chisels, stone hammers, ropes, wooden levers, and a work ethic that could make even modern fitness trainers feel ashamed. With just these rudimentary tools, they separated stones so massive that, upon seeing them, modern people often tend to think, no, impossible. There must be lasers. But no, there were no lasers, only chops, strikes, and nearly stubborn persistence. The process began by marking grooves on the stone surface with ropes dusted with charcoal, creating lines so straight they were frightening. Then dozens of workers struck bronze chisels with stone hammers, blow by blow, until the stone cracked along the desired line. It wasn't always perfect. Sometimes the stone cracked the wrong way and sighs of frustration echoed. Sometimes the chisel chipped, and they had to repair it. But astonishingly, these craftsmen did not work haphazardly. Every strike was part of a sequence passed down through generations, a skill that was not only muscular labor, but also pure art. When a stone was finally separated from the bedrock, the work had only halfway begun. Because you would never want to face the question, now, where do we drag this 5-ton block? But the ancient Egyptians never saw that as a problem. They had developed an entire professional logistics system for transporting stones, which, if any organization in the world today needed to learn supply chain management, perhaps should start with ancient Egypt. First, workers would smooth the stones by rubbing sandstone blocks continuously on the surface, creating nearly perfect rectangular blocks. Then they placed the stones on sleds, large wooden planks lubricated with water, oil, or sometimes a mud mixture to reduce friction. Interestingly, wall paintings show that the Egyptians knew to wet the sand to make it easier to pull heavy objects, a technique that modern physicists only explained as recently as 2014. Another team of workers, usually with physiques as if they had spent their lives lifting weights, would tie ropes to the sleds and pull them together toward the construction site. Imagine dozens of people stepping in unison, chanting in rhythm, pulling a stone as heavy as a mini truck, in heat that could melt your spirit. It is a scene that even modern gyms cannot recreate. Once the stone reached the base of the pyramid, another challenge began, placing it in the correct position. No one knows exactly what kind of ramps the Egyptians used, straight, spiral, encircling, or a combination. But one thing is certain, they did it with an organization that would make any modern project engineer nod in admiration. Each stone was pulled up the ramp using the same method: ropes, levers, sleds, and the perfect combination of human strength and work rhythm. When a stone arrived, supervisors would check the flatness of its surface using wooden rulers and water levels, simple but extremely precise tools. If the surface was not perfect, they would grind the stone, realign it until the block fit so tightly with its neighbors that you could barely slip a piece of paper through. This was not random. This was a construction standard maintained by the Egyptians for generations, a standard that many modern buildings cannot even achieve. And what makes it all even more astonishing is the scale of everything. The Great Pyramid contains over 2 million stone blocks. If you placed one block every 3 minutes, working 24/7 without lunch breaks or holidays, it would still take nearly a decade just to position the stones, not to mention quarrying, transporting, or designing. Yet they did it. Not by magic, not by alien technology, but by human strength, intelligence, discipline, and a culture that placed national pride above all else. So when you stand at the foot of a pyramid and look up, instead of thinking about aliens or lost civilizations, think of those workers, ordinary people, but persistent to an extraordinary degree. They did not build to impress the future. They built to serve the pharaoh, to express faith, and to leave their mark on this desert. And though they never knew it, they created one of the greatest engineering marvels humanity has ever witnessed. If you think that the greatest wonder of the pyramids lies in how tall they are or how perfect they look, then please sit down, take a sip of imaginary ancient Egyptian beer, and let me take you to the most astonishing part of the entire structure, the people behind it. Not the illusory slaves stepping out of cheap Hollywood films, not the unwilling souls forced to drag stones with vacant eyes, but an army of skilled, proud, muscular Egyptian citizens, and sometimes full of very human complaints. These labor groups did not gather haphazardly like a crowd jostling at a pier. They were a system so organized that if you dropped them into the 21st century, they could run an entire modern construction site without GPS or Google Sheets. They were divided into gangs, then further into small teams, then further into specialized units. From stone pullers, aligners, water pourers on the sand, ramp builders, to record keepers noting who worked hard that day and who pretended to have a backache to slack off. And don't think that record keeping was trivial. It was the soul of the entire project. Clerks recorded every movement of each stone block, every time a rope wore down, every team's material haul. They wrote on pottery, on walls, on anything that could record, like an ancient version of Excel timesheets, but far funnier. They were the silent enforcers ensuring that this entire mountain of stone did not descend into chaos. The personnel on the pyramid project were not just brawny laborers. This was a miniature society. Bakers turned flour into thousands of loaves daily. Brewers stirred batches of thick, energy-rich beer, keeping workers pulling stones all morning, yet still able to complain about the weather. Livestock handlers provided meat, surely busier than one could imagine. There were even doctors, or rather healers, tending everything from scratches and sprains to collisions caused by two teams trying to drag stones through the same spot. What is remarkable is that this system was not temporary. It was intentionally built. Massive worker villages arose next to the construction site, including housing, granaries, workshops, bakeries, even industrial kitchens. You can imagine this place as a combination of a military camp, residential area, and industrial complex, all operating for a single purpose: to build a tomb large enough to satisfy the pharaoh. But even with pay, food, and medical care, the work was so grueling that no phrase describes it better than, "Thank goodness we have beer." Stones so heavy that just looking at them is exhausting. Each day, hundreds of people had to coordinate in rhythm to drag them up towering ramps. No winches, no motors, only human strength, ropes, and a level of teamwork that would bring modern companies to tears. The work was not just drag stones and hope they don't fall on anyone. There was an entire art to adjusting ramps, where each time the pyramid rose a few meters, the ramps had to be modified. Ramp builders were as busy as pyramid builders. They erected, extended, dismantled, and rebuilt, all while glancing at the architect's sketches with eyes that seemed to say, "Why didn't anyone think to make a box-shaped tomb back then for simplicity?" But what made this project extraordinary was not muscle power. It was discipline and a near supernatural persistence. No one gave up just because it was hard. No one said, "This is big enough. Can we stop now?" Each person understood that they were building something that would last thousands of years, or at least something that would make their ancestors proud and keep the pharaoh from getting angry. So, what kept them going? What made tens of thousands rise early, drag stones under a deadly sun, and continue for decades? Not coercion, not the fear of whips. It was belief, profound and practical. Building the pyramids served the gods, the pharaoh, and their own afterlife. In the Egyptian mindset, this was not just work, it was participation in an eternal project, a way to inscribe one's name into something far greater than any individual. And that, more than engineering, more than tools, more than a sophisticated organizational team, is the true foundation of the pyramid, where stones were not just placed by force, but by faith. If there is one image that accurately captures the spirit of the pyramid builders, it is the scene of hundreds of workers struggling to drag a massive stone while a supervisor stands high above, looking like a part-time god, holding a directing stick and constantly shouting phrases that sound both nonsensical and terrifying. But the astonishing thing is not the shouting, but the way everything operates in rhythm. A chain of people, stone, ramp working as if someone had spent a lifetime composing a bizarre piece of music in which each beat is marked by sweat and heavy breathing. And despite all obstacles, the stones continue to move, bit by bit, as if driven by an ancient, nameless energy. Throughout this process, technique was not just a tool, it was the art of survival. When each stone, weighing several tons, had to be placed to the millimeter, the ancient Egyptians turned patience into an industrial skill. They could not make mistakes. They could not misplace a block. They could not leave gaps. A small error could ruin an entire layer, costing hundreds of hours of labor, thousands of grumbles, and perhaps a few complaints that even the god Anubis would chuckle at. Yet they persisted, and each stone placed was an absolute victory of humanity over impossibility. The best part? All of this was carried out by people who the day before were planting crops, rowing boats, or complaining about this year's unusually wet weather. Come construction season, they became the most elite workforce of the ancient world. People say Rome wasn't built in a day, but if these Egyptian workers were given the task, they would probably sit down, share a few liters of beer, look at each other, and say, "One day might be tight, but let's see." Even more astonishing was the spirit of teamwork. In a world without radios, walkie-talkies, or anyone standing high waving a red flag, like on a modern construction site, they coordinated through hand signals, synchronized chants, and a strange growl that only appears when many people are trying to move an object beyond the limits of imagination. They had to understand each other. In many cases, they had to trust each other because just one slip, one misaligned pull, or one person deciding to pause to wipe sweat could send the entire stone sliding down, taking the team's efforts with it as if fate were joking. The atmosphere on the construction site was always tense in a way you could feel even from outside. The sound of stones clashing, ropes stretching, boots squelching on wet sand poured to reduce friction, and occasionally the supervisor yelling, "Gently now," immediately followed by a worker shouting back, "I'm being gentle." All of it blended into a rough symphony that, if recorded, would probably become the soundtrack of a documentary on human perseverance. To fit the stones perfectly together, they used the plumb line grid technique, a method so simple it's hard to believe, but astonishingly effective. Just a straight rope, the weight of gravity, and the keen eye of a skilled worker. This tool, simpler than a wooden ruler, is the geometric secret behind the pyramid's sharp edges that confound modern engineers. You would think that with the technology of the time, errors must have been large, surfaces uneven, gaps visible somewhere. But no, layer fit layer, edge joined edge, as if the entire structure had been executed with ancient CAD drawings, except the only tools they had were rope, stone, and extraordinary memory. The higher they went, the greater the challenge. Each stone had to pass through a series of temporary ramps, wedges, flat surfaces, and of course, a series of complaints that were anything but temporary. Thinner air, stronger wind, harsher sun, but no one was allowed to stop. Because if you paused, the stone behind would immediately remind you how quickly gravity works. This was not just labor. This was the boundary between engineering and daring. Yet they still moved forward, stone by stone, step by step, pull by pull. Every new foot of height was proof that humans build not just with muscles, they build with an irrational will that no mountain can resist. That is what makes a wonder. Not gods, not aliens, not lost technology, but real people, with calloused hands, aching legs, determined minds, and a strong belief that if they placed this stone perfectly, their lives and their dynasty would be immortalized. When we think of the pyramids, we often imagine them as immutable structures, massive stones standing silently for millennia. But in reality, if we look more closely, the pyramids resemble a giant recording left by the ancient Egyptians, a record telling of their power, science, religion, and even their spiritual obsessions. Within each layer of stone are every decision, every experiment, every trial and error, and every small victory they achieved during the construction of the greatest work of their civilization. Reading these traces, we realize that the Egyptians were not just building a tomb, they were constructing a message. We lived, we understood this world, and we have left a mark forever. But the most fascinating thing is this: the pyramids are not only symbols of royal power, they are also a stage for the evolution of bold engineering thinking. Construction supervisors had to calculate not just weight, length, and height, but also factors such as sand subsidence, the expansion of stone under desert heat, and even wind direction during different seasons. Many modern researchers have tried to reconstruct their methods, and most agree the ancient Egyptians did not work haphazardly. They worked like true engineers. They measured, marked, adjusted, experimented, and optimized. No laser technology, no theodolites, but they had something even more powerful: a measurement system based on rigorous reasoning and knowledge passed down through generations. What excites archaeologists is the ability to align the pyramids with the cardinal points with near impossible precision. The deviation of the edges from the four cardinal directions is only a fraction of a degree. Some modern observers, looking at that precision, immediately exclaim, "Impossible! This is alien technology!" But in reality, there is a completely human explanation. The Egyptians used the sun, shadows, the North Star, and even long water troughs to determine perfect straight lines. When the water was calm, it became an absolute reference line, and they applied this with almost superhuman patience. This obsession with precision was not only external. Inside the structure, everything was designed to maximize durability, optimize the flow of spiritual energy, according to their religious beliefs, and simultaneously deter the notorious tomb robbers who appeared even in ancient times. Imagine that. Imagine that. You are building a structure hundreds of meters tall over decades, and while building, you must anticipate that future generations will try to break in to steal treasures. This reality made secret passages, false corridors, sliding stone doors, and sealed sections an essential part of the pyramid. But the pyramid was not just a defensive maze, it was also an astronomical map. Many researchers have found that the positions of the rooms and corridors may relate to important constellations, particularly Orion and Sirius, two constellations associated with the god Osiris and the goddess Isis. For the Egyptians, death was not simply an end, it was a journey to a structured celestial realm. The pyramid, in that view, is a physical gateway for the pharaoh to step onto the path of the stars and begin an immortal life. This explains why some tunnels were constructed at angles precise to the degree, pointing directly at specific stars at the time of the pharaoh's death. It is strange to think that thousands of years ago, while most of the world still lived in small villages, raised livestock, and built mud huts, the Egyptians calculated star cycles, the sun's movements, flood seasons, and even how to create a building that could stand for 4,500 years. Sometimes it feels as if they were millennia ahead of their time. But the truth is simpler. They had unwavering faith in the cosmic order, and when faith combined with engineering, it created wonders. However, behind all this grandeur remains a big question. Who did the pyramids truly serve? The pharaoh, the gods, or the Egyptians themselves? Some historians hypothesize that beyond the religious role, the pyramids were also a national project, a social work season. During the flood season, farmers could not cultivate crops. Instead of letting them stay idle at home, the state mobilized them for construction, paying them with food, beer, clothing, and social security. This means that the pyramid was not just a tomb, but also an economic engine, a way to keep society stable, prevent discontent, and foster a sense of unity. And perhaps this is what truly makes the pyramids extraordinary. They were not just a structure built by a group of people. They are the crystallization of collective intelligence. thousands of minds, tens of thousands of hands, and a common goal so great that an entire nation was willing to contribute. Each stone was placed not just with muscle, but with the belief that they were serving something greater than themselves, a legacy that would remain in the desert longer than their names. That is what makes the pyramids an immortal symbol. Not just height, not just precision, not just mystery, but the story of a civilization daring to dream a dream big enough to challenge time. In that context, the most frightening thing was not a sudden slash in the darkness, but the fact that highway robbers, though considered outcasts, were actually a natural product of their time. They did not merely exploit the weakness of the ruling system. They grew from the cracks of feudal society itself. When constant wars led to mercenaries being discharged, when heavy taxes drove peasants to desperation, when the law could not reach the forests and mountains, it was there that the dark children of the era formed and thrived. Essentially, medieval highway gangs were like weeds growing from soil too barren to nurture justice, yet too fertile to cultivate despair. What made them formidable was not just their weapons, but their almost instinctive understanding of human psychology. A traveler, alone or in a small group, always carried a deeply ingrained fear, the fear of being watched. The robbers exploited this thoroughly. They knew panic would cause mistakes, and with just one moment of inattention, an entire caravan could be swallowed by the deep forest. It is no coincidence that many contemporary records describe ambushes as if darkness itself turned into people. That is the most accurate description. The robbers blended with their environment, not just tactically, but mentally. But the interesting and ironic thing is that many highway gangs operated according to a logic that today we might call an underground economy. They collected tolls from those who wanted to pass safely. Some groups even protected forest areas, demanding money in exchange for the right to travel in peace. Some travelers agreed to pay to avoid risk, treating it like a toll, almost as if they were dealing with a parallel government. This shows a reality. Wherever central authority was weak, the strong imposed their own laws, and the law of the forest was often far harsher than the law of the castle or the church. And as a paradox of the era, while these gangs spread fear, they also inadvertently created their own ecosystem. Roadside taverns became hubs of news exchange, merchants sharing the safest routes, secret scouts marking potential targets, storytellers weaving half-truth legends about notorious thieves. There were also small roadside chapels where priests lit candles for travelers, though they knew that prayer alone could not replace an armed escort. All these elements contributed to a picture of medieval roads as both dangerous and vivid, a world where every journey was paid for with anxiety. Going further, we can see the strange contrast between the lofty ideals of the era and the harsh reality outside city walls. In the cities, knights sang of honor, loyalty, and protecting the weak, while outside, the weak became the fattest prey. Knights in literature always helped the needy. Real-life knights sometimes had to hire guards just to survive the forest. This was a major disconnect in feudal society. The glorious ideals painted in epics could not withstand the brutal reality of medieval roads. Even more interesting was the emergence of real-life Robin Hoods, but far less romantic than the legend. Some gangs claimed to protect the poor, rob the rich, and distribute spoils to villagers. However, such actions were often strategic rather than altruistic. They bribed locals to remain silent, avoiding reports to authorities. Yet the existence of such figures shows that the line between hero and criminal was often thin, and history is recorded by those lucky enough to survive to tell the tale. In some regions, highway robbery was so severe that lords had to organize hunting parties comparable to armies. But like chasing a ghost, victories were often temporary. Every gang eliminated made way for another to take its place. When environment, poverty, and war create an endless supply of desperate men, completely eradicating highway robbery is almost impossible. For this reason, traveling in medieval Europe was always accompanied by tension, as if every step required weighing progress against retreat. Notably, this danger created a distinctive culture, the road survival culture. Travelers learned to read the signs of the forest, distinguish natural sounds from human ones, choose routes appropriate to the season, and most importantly, be cautious of strangers who were overly friendly. Some entries in Pilgrim's diaries show that spending nights safely without encountering robbers was considered a small miracle. From these experiences, countless folktales, legends, and warnings were passed down from generation to generation, all depicting a world where roads were not just means of travel, but tests of survival. In the overall picture, it can be said that medieval Europe was shaped not only by castles, monasteries, and knightly epics, but also by the shadows lurking on the roads between them. Travel at the time was not merely moving from point A to point B, it was a test of intellect, courage, and luck. And this harshness created a defining feature of the era, a world where the grandeur of kingdoms was balanced, mercilessly, by the unseen dangers on the forest paths. The sight of bodies hanging limply was not merely punishment, it was the ultimate message, a blood-stained declaration of the era that order, fragile though it might be, still existed. For many travelers, passing by those sun-exposed corpses was an experience that left them silent for a long time. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers, but all understood that they were only a misstep or a wrong glance away from the same fate. The hastily erected wooden scaffolds at those crossroads became a reminder that medieval roads did not merely lead people to towns, monasteries, or markets. They sometimes led them to the brink of death. Yet that deterrent, however terrifying, could not completely eradicate highway robbery. The reason was simple. Poverty and instability never stopped producing desperate men. When crops failed, when wars burned villages, when landlords imposed taxes harsher than peasants could bear, many men had no other choice. Some fled the villages into forests, joining gangs as a means of survival. Ironically, some who were once honest people, once gentle farmers, were pushed to the edge by life, and their final step was to plunge into the darkness of the law. These individuals were often the most dangerous robbers, not because they were cruel, but because they knew there was no turning back. A poor man caught could be whipped or sent to forced labor. A robber caught would be hanged without complex trial, and that desperation made them fight more fiercely, act more recklessly, and behave more undisciplinedly. That is why many patrols feared newly formed gangs more than long-established ones. The old robbers could weigh the value of an attack. Newcomers had nothing to lose. Meanwhile, travelers increasingly developed their own survival strategies. Some wealthy merchants hired experienced guards, equipped with light armor to fight and flee if necessary. Pilgrims traveled in large groups so that robbers would hesitate before ambushing. There were routes labeled, "Do not travel at night," "Do not stop by day," and even signals that could be called diplomacy with the dark, items discreetly placed on the path as silent messages to robbers that they had nothing of value. Occasionally, these methods worked. Usually, they did not. Merchants had a different priority: speed. They wanted to pass through dangerous areas before robbers learned of their journey. For many did not know that robbers had eyes and ears everywhere. Drunken men in inns, water sellers along the road, even market workers could inadvertently reveal information. A single comment like, "This caravan is heading straight north," could be a death sentence for the travelers. Information spread so fast that many gangs even knew in advance the next stop of merchants. Meanwhile, the nobility presented a different story, both cruel and bitter. They had the money to hire guards, but arrogance was their vulnerability. Many nobles believed that heraldic symbols or gold-embroidered cloaks would intimidate others. The truth was the opposite. All robbers saw was a high-value prey. Some gangs, especially those with warriors who had fought in wars, did not hesitate to confront the nobles' guards directly. Some robbers even considered capturing a viscount or knight a personal achievement, like hunters displaying a deer's head on a wall. Capturing nobles often led to ransom demands, opening a dark but highly profitable business. One gang could temporarily live in luxury from a single operation. Yet sometimes their cruelty exceeded expectations. Nobles notorious for exploiting peasants, imposing heavy taxes or abusing village women often became targets of vengeance. Stories of these deeds, when reaching the estates, forced many lords to change their routes, even detouring dozens of miles just to avoid a cursed forest. At the lowest level of society, peasants and poor travelers, the journey had a different meaning. It was not trade, not a spiritual journey, not a stroll of the privileged. It was survival. They carried food for a few days, coats warm enough for a cold night, and hope strong enough to traverse forests they simply called the forests of darkness. When robbed, they did not merely lose property, they risked their lives. A stolen loaf of bread could kill a peasant within 3 days. A pair of shoes taken could make them collapse before reaching home. Each blow not only caused pain, but destroyed the future of their family. Although patrol forces tried their best, the truth remained. No one had complete control of the roads. The struggle between order and chaos was like two sides of a coin, appearing alternately according to the wind, the harvest season, or the mood of local lords. And in that gap, a gap that the law could not fill, fear became the greatest power. That is also why highway robbers persisted. They were products of their era, of the darkness enveloping the roads, and of the fragile expectations people placed on safety. On medieval roads, steel was only the visible part. The hidden and far more dangerous part was the darkness of psychology, of rumors, of whispers passed down through generations. And for highway robbers, it was these invisible things that were the most powerful weapons. As Marco Polo ventured deeper into the lands of Persia and Armenia, he gradually realized that each community had its own notions of obligation and honor, many of which were entirely at odds with European society at the time. In Venice, church law and patriarchal authority controlled every aspect of marriage. Dowries were meticulously recorded, marital relations followed strict rituals, and any deviation was considered a sin before God. But upon setting foot in cities between the Caucasus deserts and the Iranian plateau, Marco noticed that marriage was sometimes not the permanent bond he was accustomed to, but a more flexible social arrangement, reflecting the necessities of survival amid vast wilderness. In some nomadic tribes, welcoming strangers was regarded as a sacred ritual. A man opening the door of his tent did not merely offer a meal, but also extended trust, sometimes granting favors that Westerners might view as exceeding the bounds of courtesy. This was not moral decay. For them, it was a way to strengthen alliances between strangers and hosts, ensuring that on lawless roads a person would be protected if they later found themselves in someone else's territory. Marco observed this not only with surprise, but with curiosity. He began to understand that social norms were always tied to the circumstances in which people had to live. The deeper he traveled into the Iranian plateau, the more Marco was drawn to local folklore, legends of desert guardian spirits, ancient kings buried in the sands, and wealthy cities that once flourished but disappeared without a trace. These stories, according to locals, were used for moral instruction or to preserve collective memory, but to Marco, they seemed like pieces of a vast world far beyond anything he had known. Westerners often thought they held the center of civilization, but the farther he traveled, the more Marco realized that Europe was merely a small fragment of that immense picture. As the caravan continued through the small towns along the Silk Road, Marco encountered customs of hospitality he had never imagined. In many parts of Persia, refusing to shelter a traveler in distress was considered an unforgivable act, worse than theft. Some families were so poor that they had only a single piece of bread, yet they would tear it in half to share with guests, because for them, hospitality was not just a social duty, but a way to preserve family honor. Providing a place to sleep, water to drink, and sometimes armed protection was taken for granted. Marco even recorded that in some places, a guest was considered part of the household for the duration of their stay, and anyone who attacked them would face retribution from the entire family. These observations confronted Marco with a truth. Civilization was not measured merely by grand churches or famous universities, but by how people treated one another in uncertain situations. On roads where survival depended on the kindness of strangers, these seemingly strange customs became the threads connecting small communities across harsh lands. The most striking contrast Marco witnessed was the role of family in Eastern societies. In Venice, the family was a basic unit, but also a cage, binding individuals to rigid social norms. In Armenia or Persia, the family was the only fortress against instability, a center of economic power, honor, and loyalty. Marriage alliances were sometimes not the result of love or morality, but a means to expand territory, protect a caravan, or create trade networks. Marco realized that many Western values he had considered universal were actually products of a small Adriatic coastal region. As the caravan journeyed eastward, Marco entered lands divided by war but rich in culture. He recorded sprawling markets where spices, pearls, gemstones, and silk were traded as though they were everyday goods. Local merchants shared secret routes with him, mountain passes that opened only in dry seasons, and peoples who appeared only after sunset. Marco had heard many strange tales in Venice, but facing them directly made him realize the vastness of the world. Yet Marco's journey carried not only novelty and hospitality, it also carried danger. The lands he traversed, though accustomed to aiding strangers, were not immune to groups of bandits using the terrain for concealment. Marco quickly realized that justice here was unlike in Europe. There were no patrolling sheriffs, no courts to adjudicate. Justice belonged to the powerful, and safety was determined by the honor of the tribe or the reputation of the family protecting you. What overwhelmed him was that, despite loose legal systems, many areas had far lower crime rates than Venice. When personal and familial honor was valued above gold, betrayal or aggression against the innocent could have catastrophic consequences for an entire lineage, a form of unwritten law even emperors could scarcely alter. Marco continued his journey and approached the first gates of inland Asia, where great civilizations met like converging waves. Fortresses built to protect the roads from desert storms also preserved stories of human endurance. Warriors who died defending caravans, women keeping fires alive through the night, and children growing up amid cultural exchanges that even adults struggled to fully comprehend. It was then that Marco realized he was not merely a young merchant on a trading route. He was a witness to a world Europe had never dreamed of, a world in which every encounter, every social ritual, and every shared meal expanded the boundaries of imagination. What he recorded was not merely a story of silk and spices, but a story of how humans create meaning across vast lands where only wind, sand, and an endless journey prevail. As Marco Polo ventured deeper into the world of the Eurasian nomadic tribes, he realized that what he had once believed to be social norms in Venice was merely a small slice of the countless cultural systems humans had created. The moments he witnessed on the steppes, from marriage negotiations taking place right beside freely running herds of horses to women commanding young men to set up camp, challenged all of his Western preconceptions. For the nomads, power was not always in the hands of men. It resided in survival skills, dexterity, and practical roles within the tribal organization. And women naturally became the center of these axes of power. Marco wrote about Turkic and Mongol women with a mix of curiosity, admiration, and a measure of astonishment. They were not veiled nor confined within cold stone houses like Venetian women. They rode horses as adeptly as men, knew how to use bows, could assess the health of livestock, and had an important voice in choosing winter camp locations. Some women possessed leadership skills to the extent that they were entrusted with negotiating with neighboring tribes, a task Marco subtly implied that few in Venice could even imagine. Yet what captured his attention most was the nomad's approach to marriage. In Persia, he had witnessed the coexistence of formal and temporary marriages, but on the steppes, this flexibility went even further. A marriage could be arranged to strengthen a military alliance in exchange for livestock or to unite two long-standing nomadic families. And if circumstances changed, if the tribe moved, if water sources dried up, or if a new conflict erupted, these relationships could be pragmatically restructured without being bound by religious prejudices. Marco emphasized repeatedly that nomadic women were not subjects to be controlled, but holders of family stability. When men went on extended military campaigns, women managed the entire camp, protected property, or the livestock remained safe. He described a scene of a Mongol woman standing in the middle of the camp yard, holding a leather whip, directing each young man in their assigned tasks and everyone obeying with absolute respect. To Marco, it was a spectacle both foreign and striking to a European medieval mindset. His notes also reveal the close connection between nomadic life and emotional relationships. On the steppes, loneliness was a greater enemy than any sandstorm or predator. Thus, people sought each other's company for warmth, storytelling, or temporary companionship during long journeys. Marco never described his own experiences explicitly. He always left a deliberately vague space, in keeping with the style of a storyteller addressing a European audience. but subtle hints indicate he was acutely aware that these non traditional relationships played an essential role in the community's spiritual life. He also observed an interesting phenomenon: the link between economy and emotion. In many cases, an exchange of livestock, a trade agreement, or an alliance treaty could lead to families betrothing their children to one another. These marriages served not only survival purposes, but also acted as bonds between groups of people constantly on the move. Marco realized that on the Silk Road, love, loyalty, and pragmatism were always intertwined in ways that Europe could scarcely understand. As he continued traveling with the caravans, witnessing gatherings in large camp yards at night, he described the atmosphere as a vivid tableau of the world. Flickering fires reflecting on faces from 5 or 6 different cultures, unfamiliar music never heard in Venice, stories told in many voices and beliefs. In this space, the boundaries between stranger and acquaintance blurred. A Chinese merchant might rest his head on the shoulder of a Mongol guide. A woman from Samarkand might teach a dance to people from Anatolia, and an Armenian could share a meal with those who did not speak his language. Marco understood that all of this, relationships as delicate as silk yet strong as steel, was precisely why the Silk Road existed. Not merely for silk, not merely for gold or spices, but because humans found each other across these vast lands. These encounters, whether fleeting or enduring, created cultural connections stronger than any empire. And within that current, Marco Polo matured. He no longer viewed the world as a Venetian coming to record, but as someone learning to immerse himself in a broader reality. A reality where women could be leaders, where marriage could be temporary, where affection could arise unshackled by doctrine, and where humans connected through courage on endless journeys. The journey through Persia and Central Asia taught Marco not only about geography or commerce, it taught him that human society is never a fixed template. It is a flowing current, and he was fortunate to witness it at its most vivid. Marco Polo quickly realized that the young women recruited into the Khan's court were not merely ornaments of power, but a sophisticated apparatus operating alongside the military, diplomacy, and commerce. They were trained to become complete artists, keepers of protocol, and sometimes gatekeepers for private negotiations between lords, envoys, and families within the empire. In the Mongol world, where a single word could alter the fate of an entire tribe, the subtle skills of women were as valuable as a cavalryman's bow. Marco described the selection process as a solemn ritual. From distant lands of Persia and Central Asia to the edges of Cathay, families sent their daughters as a prestigious form of tribute. Those chosen were not only beautiful, but had to demonstrate refinement in every gesture. They learned to pour wine without spilling a drop, to walk so that the hem of their silk dress made a sound as light as the wind, and to use a smile to soothe an angry general. This was the art of soft power, a weapon that medieval Europe never fully understood. What impressed Marco most was the combination of grace and inner strength. These women, despite living amidst luxury, were far from weak. They were taught to ride horses, distinguish medicinal herbs, organize a diplomatic feast in an instant, and sometimes offer strategic counsel to rulers. In this vast empire, where a single decision could reverberate across thousands of miles, the quiet opinions from the harem could influence an entire military campaign. Many Westerners often imagined the Khan's harem as a luxurious maze dominated by desire. Marco, with the eyes of a merchant observer, saw a different truth. It was a political apparatus refined over centuries of nomadic life. Each concubine, each young woman, had clearly defined duties. The one managing rituals, the one handling private correspondence, the one overseeing diplomatic gifts, and the one responsible for hosting etiquette that the West would never dare describe on paper. Intimacy here was not merely personal pleasure. It was a means of exchanging trust, building loyalty, and in many cases reinforcing alliances stretching to the borders of Europe. Marco observed them moving through the palace like seasoned performers. When the Khan hosted banquets, they were present everywhere, graceful yet efficient, simultaneously attending to guests, listening to political discourse, and remembering who came from where and what gifts they carried. The smile of a young woman could signal the start of a negotiation. A short song could serve as a blessing of peace for a foreign envoy. These small gestures created an atmosphere in which merchants, lords, and officials could feel the attention of the empire. But the true power of these women did not lie in public moments, but when the harem doors closed. Marco alluded to nightly conversations where concubines discussed the rise and fall of families, who would have the honor of bearing heirs, or which advice should reach the Khan by morning. These were not European-style intrigues for favor, but political calculations in a society where every relationship was tied to the power of the entire empire. Some women reached positions nearly equal to generals. They supervised servants, controlled the palace finances, managed diplomatic gifts, and occasionally acted as intermediaries between rebellious lords and the court. Marco saw in them a form of silent power, no swords, no armor, yet capable of altering the fate of thousands. Hospitality in the Mongol court also had a distinctive character, far beyond anything Marco had known. Important guests were welcomed with banquets where music and dance intertwined with fermented mare's milk. Young women, professionally trained, served as symbols of the utmost respect for guests. At times, this intimacy was not meant to impress, but as a traditional ritual, a way to show that the court regarded visitors as family. Marco was careful in describing these moments, but the implication in his words conveyed far more than he wrote. What amazed Marco most was how the harem and the court coordinated seamlessly, like two sides of the same map of power. In Europe, authority was typically confined to men, but in the Khan's court, women held half the stability of the empire, half soft but indispensable. They were both guardians of culture, bridges between peoples, and protectors of traditions that maintained unity across dozens of ethnic groups. And when Marco left the Mongol court for Cathay, he carried with him the awareness that power in the wider world was greater than he had ever imagined. It was not only swords, war horses, or edicts. There was also the art of subtlety, the refinement of music, the gentle breath of silk, and the strange strength of relationships woven by women whom Western history had almost entirely forgotten. Mark Antony entered the ranks not out of idealism, but because Rome had given him no other choice. Every creditor wanted to tighten the rope around his neck. Every banquet revealed how far he was sliding toward the abyss. Yet the battlefield, bitter, brutal, and honest, saw in the young man what the streets of Rome never had, a born warrior. Antony adapted to the rhythm of the army as if it were a place he had always belonged. He rode horses like a man born on the desert, wielded a spear as though it were an extension of his own arm. And most importantly, he inspired the men trembling on the edge of life and death. In his first campaigns in Judea and Egypt, Antony did not merely fight, he performed. Stories passed among the soldiers told of how he would rush into the midst of flying arrows to save a young soldier whose name he had never known. On another occasion, during a rainy night when the camp was desperate with sickness and lack of provisions, Antony stepped forward, raised a cup of wine, and shouted that they would not die among tattered tents. They would return to Rome with spoils of war, and they believed him. They followed him not because of orders, but because of the magnetism of a man who lived like a flame. That flame attracted Julius Caesar. When Caesar met Antony, he saw in the young man what many generals only wished for: absolute loyalty, fearless audacity, and the ability to stir the hearts of soldiers. Caesar brought Antony into his power apparatus, and Antony, for the first time in his life, had a worthy mentor. Caesar taught him not only how to fight, but also how to govern. Not only fists, but words. Not only passion, but strategy. Antony became a right hand, a left hand, and sometimes the shadow of Caesar. Yet, that magnetism also caused tension. In Rome, the soldiers' affection for Antony was seen as a threat. Conservative senators whispered that a man idolized by troops was the seed of tyranny. Antony laughed. He paid no mind to intrigue until the dagger of conspiracy struck straight into the heart of Rome. When Caesar was assassinated in the Senate, Antony became the only survivor brave enough to look directly at the body of his friend and realize that from that moment, the world would never be the same. The conspirators hoped Antony would fear, flee, or act foolishly, but instead he did what only a man like Antony could do. He turned grief into fire. The funeral oration for Caesar was not merely a political moment. It was the moment that defined Antony's entire life. Every word he spoke, every gesture, every pause was like an arrow piercing the heart of Rome itself. When he lifted Caesar's blood-stained cloak, the crowd erupted like a storm. Rome burned, and Antony was the one who lit the flame. But even Antony's power could not withstand what awaited him. Octavian. Octavian, the young heir of Caesar, did not possess Antony's magnetism, nor his stature, nor the roar of battle, but he had what Antony never did: cold patience, a mind sharp as a blade, and ambition wrapped in apparent weakness. Antony realized too late that the most dangerous adversary was not the valiant warrior, but the silent serpent. For a time, they shook hands, divided Rome, even split the Adriatic into two territories. But that peace was only a fragile bridge built on oaths and suspicion. Antony departed Rome for the east, determined to consolidate his power in Egypt, and there he met Cleopatra, the encounter that would define his fate. Cleopatra was unlike any woman Antony had ever known. It was not beauty that subdued him, but intellect. She was a combination of scholar, queen, strategist, artist, and political symbol. Cleopatra spoke to Antony as if there were no empire, no council chambers, no history, only two minds grasping the true weight of power. The attraction between them was no mere game of fate. It was a dangerous alliance forged with emotion, interest, ambition, and trust. Antony needed Egypt. Cleopatra needed Rome, and both needed each other. From then on, Antony was drawn into the struggle between two worlds: Rome and the East, duty and passion, ambition and love. Those years made him a figure that historians could never neatly categorize, both a heroic warrior of the battlefield and a man led by the heart. Both the last Roman warrior of the old tradition and a dreamer who believed an empire could be shared by two people. Octavian understood this, and he knew it was the one weakness sufficient to destroy a man like Antony. Their final confrontation was not only a military battle, but a clash of human natures. Antony fought with loyalty, fervor, and fire. Octavian fought with cold calculation, timing, and strategy. At Actium, all of Rome seemed to witness the collision of two souls, one fighting for love, the other for power. When Antony fell, it was not merely a political defeat. It was a historical moment witnessing a style of manhood, courage, magnanimity, passion, overcome by a new world, a world of strategy, propaganda, and control. Antony and Cleopatra became the last of a bygone era. And when he fell, it was the soldiers who had followed him to the ends of the earth who said, "He was the last man who could make us fight for something greater than ourselves." Antony lived like a storm and departed like a legend. When the flames rose from the makeshift funeral pyre erected in the middle of the square, Rome realized that the moment was not merely the funeral of a leader. It was the death knell for the fragile stability that the Republic had clung to for decades. And Antony, the man who had just turned a solemn event into a political storm, stood at the center of it all. He did not order the people to riot, but he did not stop them either. His eyes followed every burning log, every angry shout, every torch etched against the gray Roman sky. Somehow, without saying a word, he allowed the people to do what he knew he was not supposed to do: take revenge. As the conspirators fled the city, they realized they were no longer facing a dead Caesar. They were facing a living man, and one far more dangerous. Antony, now holding the crowd, the army, and a reputation newly ignited on the ashes of the old leader, became the one they feared most. But Antony did not act immediately. He did not rush into war, did not shed blood right away. He understood that Rome at that moment did not need another general. Rome needed someone who could control the chaos spreading faster than the fire devouring the square. Antony began to apply the power he wielded best: human influence. In the days that followed, he carefully observed every movement of the crowd. He skillfully reassured, encouraged, and sometimes, secretly, ignited righteous anger at just the right moment. He wanted the world to know that Caesar's death was not the end, but the beginning of a new era, an era in which he could play a central role. Yet fate never allowed Antony to stand alone on the stage for long. Another figure was rising, quietly but dangerously: Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, the man whom the will, just read publicly, had placed at the center of a new seismic power shift. The young man appeared harmless, frail, sickly, inexperienced in battle, but Rome had seen enough seemingly weak men whose ambition was forged of steel, and Antony, with all his confidence, completely misjudged his new opponent. At first, Antony believed the young man was just a minor detail in a larger picture, a nominal heir to be protected, guided, then set aside. He did not realize that Octavian possessed something no one else in Rome had: legitimacy. Caesar's legacy, wealth, prestige, and authority, now belonged to a young man barely in his 20s, whose eyes were colder than his frail appearance suggested. That was Antony's first mistake. He underestimated the young man's political will. Octavian feared Antony not at all. He knew his strength lay elsewhere. The loyalty of the people, stirred by Antony, was also Caesar's people, and therefore his own. And in the darkness of a shaken Rome, Octavian whispered, maneuvered, bribed, connected with every officer, every veteran who had fought under Caesar. He did not need to roar. He only needed to show them the will, only to remind them that they had once fought for Caesar, and now he was the rightful heir. Antony began to realize that he no longer held everything as he imagined. The crowd still followed him, but the army began to fracture. The Senate, long hostile to him, saw in Octavian a useful tool to curb Antony's power. Dormant factions awoke, beginning to whisper promises, secret agreements beneath the shadow of Pompey's assassinated statue. And in that chaotic picture, Antony still tried to maintain his stance. He gathered legions, called upon provincial governors, declared himself the only one capable of maintaining order. But the times changed too quickly. Rome was no longer the city that he and Caesar once held in the palm of their hands. Now it resembled a wounded beast, and every faction wanted to strike the final blow. The conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, believed they had seized the moment to restore the Republic. But they had forgotten that the Republic they were trying to save had long since died. The Roman people no longer wished to return to an antiquated government where a few hundred nobles vied for power. They wanted stability, they wanted strength, and now they faced three names: Antony, Octavian, and the ghost of Caesar still haunting Rome. Antony realized this sooner than anyone. He understood that victory at this moment did not mean defeating an enemy, but capturing the heart of Rome. But that heart was divided. The people loved him for his intensity, yet they loved Octavian for Caesar's name. And so, in a city both mourning and rioting, two men with completely opposite natures began a race for power that would shape Rome's fate for decades. Antony had strength, experience, the loyalty of veterans, and the ability to stir the passions of the masses like a musician playing a familiar instrument. Octavian had cold calculation, bottomless ambition, and the name Caesar like a sword pointed straight at anyone daring to stand in his way. Rome became the stage for this confrontation. A confrontation not just between two men, but between two visions of the future for an empire in turmoil. And from here, Antony's fate would be tested in ways he had never imagined, not by the swords of his enemies, but by the cunning of a young man determined to surpass the shadow of Caesar. The final war of the Roman Republic did not begin with cheers, but with a cold declaration carefully engineered by Octavian: it is not Rome against Marcus Antony, but Rome against Cleopatra. In a single moment, Antony, once hailed as the spiritual successor of Caesar, became the symbol of betrayal. And the war was no longer between two Roman statesmen, but a mortal clash between two civilizations: the West against the East, Roman tradition against the seduction of Egypt. Antony saw the dark clouds before they arrived. He knew Octavian was weaving an image of himself as the hero of the Republic, the man who would purge the Eastern corruption that Antony was accused of falling into. But Antony, though once a fierce warrior, was not a wise politician. He responded with marches, proclamations, and complicated strategies, while Octavian needed only one weapon: Rome's absolute support. In Alexandria, Cleopatra saw what Antony refused to accept. She understood that Octavian did not simply want power. He wanted to erase Antony's legacy, turn him into a historical criminal, and build himself up as Caesar's only rightful successor. Cleopatra urged Antony to act faster, stronger, more decisively. She knew that time was their most formidable enemy. And so, in 32 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra prepared for a war they knew would decide not only their fate, but the fate of the entire Mediterranean. They gathered a fleet from Egypt, Syria, Phoenicia, Cilicia, a massive naval force unseen since the Hellenistic kings after Alexander. Huge ships, heavily armed, designed to crush enemies with raw power. But Octavian had what Antony lacked: Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, the greatest admiral of his generation, a naval strategist so brilliant that even Caesar, had he lived, would have bowed to him. While Antony prepared in traditional fashion, Agrippa struck the weakest link, the supply lines. He tore apart Antony's logistics network, seized coastal bases across Greece, and cut off fuel, grain, and Antony's hope of holding out against Octavian. The war unfolded not through grand clashes, but through small, precise cuts, each one a blade slicing into Antony's ambitions. When the summer of 31 BCE arrived, Antony was forced to move his fleet out of Actium's harbor before total collapse. Cleopatra, fully grasping the desperation of the situation, urged a strategic withdrawal to Egypt and continuation of the war on land, where Antony was strongest. But the pride of a Roman general would not allow him to abandon a naval battle, even if it was the wisest choice. On September 2nd, the Ionian Sea swelled under strange winds, as if nature itself knew this was the day that would decide the fate of two empires. On one side stood the massive fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, huge, heavy ships floating fortresses. On the other was Agrippa's agile, maneuverable force, smaller but far more flexible and crewed by seasoned veterans. When battle erupted, the contrast became catastrophe. Antony's giant ships could not turn in time. The winds shifted, battle smoke blanketed the waters, and Antony's orders vanished into chaos. Agrippa, like a patient hunter, avoided direct assault, choosing instead to encircle, isolate, and consume the enemy piece by piece. And then, at the center of the chaos, Cleopatra made a decision history would forever debate. She withdrew her squadron and sailed straight for Egypt. Antony, seeing the familiar gold sails, abandoned his fleet, still locked in combat, and followed her. Some historians call it cowardice, others say it was a calculated retreat, but for the Roman soldiers still fighting on the waters of Actium, it was the moment their spirits were crushed. Without Antony, his fleet collapsed. Without the fleet, Antony lost Greece. Without Greece, he lost Rome. After Actium, Octavian did not rush to attack. He allowed Antony and Cleopatra to wither on their own, to lose allies, to collapse in isolation. Alexandria, once the heart of Hellenistic civilization, became a gilded cage where the two clung to the remnants of their power. Antony, once a general who made all of Europe tremble, now was only a tired, defeated shadow, grasping at vanished glory. Cleopatra, still proud, still cunning, still resplendent, knew the game was nearly over. When Octavian's forces entered Egypt in 30 BCE, they did not meet an undefeated Antony. They met a man who already understood his own failure. Antony tried to muster his remaining troops, but the banners were torn, the cheers were gone, and the Roman fire that once burned in him was now only ashes. He fought his final battle not to win, but to retain a fragment of dignity. But when defeat became inevitable, Antony chose the death of a Roman. He fell upon his own sword. And when Cleopatra heard the news, she knew that a great chapter of history had closed. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror of a city, but as the conqueror of an era. Rome's civil wars were over. The Roman Empire had been born. And the man who forged it was not Antony, who had once fought beside Caesar, but Octavian, who defeated him with intellect, time, and ruthless coldness. Mark Antony lived like a warrior, loved like a storm, and died like a Roman trying to preserve the last shred of his honor. But those very strengths, his intensity, loyalty, passion, also became the weaknesses that led him to tragedy. And Octavian understood what Antony never did. To rule the world, one does not need to be the strongest lion, only the one who survives long enough to tell the story.